Consider the following question. What is a good life? What is it that separates a good human life from a bad human life? This is the sort of question that will inspire a seemingly infinite number of different answers. Is the good life concerned with career success, the attainment of power, the pursuit of knowledge, maybe the enjoyment of simple delights, engaging in conversation with a good friend? Or maybe it's the solitary contemplation of nature or the participation in the ancient traditions of one's community and culture. On the other hand, we might also ask, are there any constraints on what a good human life could look like? Could someone who is morally wicked live a good life? What about someone who suffers horrible tragedies in their life? Or someone who is born with very few natural talents and gifts? Among all these questions and all these different perspectives on living a good human life, it may be tempting to suppose that there's really no objective answer to this question. There are just different kinds of lives that people live, different ways of living that people are attracted to, but no real answer as to what constitutes a good or perfect and flourishing human life. Perhaps each individual is just the ultimate authority on what constitutes their own human flourishing. However, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived from 382 BC to 322 BC, believed that there is a real objective good for human beings. There is a real purpose to human life that we can discover through reason and embody in our everyday lives. There is a final, ultimate, or chief good toward which all of our other actions aim and which gives purpose, meaning, and coherence to our life. Not only does Aristotle believe that there is such a truth about what is a good human life, but he believes that it can be investigated rigorously. In fact, Aristotle believes that there is a science of the human good. Now, whereas today we tend to use the word science to refer narrowly to investigation of the physical world, Aristotle understood it more broadly to refer to really any kind of pursuit of knowledge. In this case, practical knowledge about how to live well. As such, if there is a science of the human good, then that means there must be something to know about the human good. There must be some truth about what it means to live a good human life. And in Aristotle's most famous work on ethics, entitled the Nicomachean Ethics, he sets out to discover that truth. Furthermore, the very title of this book tells us something important. The book is named after and dedicated to Aristotle's son Nicomachus. And this makes perfect sense because if Aristotle is right, then there is a sense in which parenting would be an activity which in part requires philosophical knowledge. The responsibility of a parent is to raise a child in a way that enables them to develop well and live a good human life. So, if there is a science of the human good, then it would be of the utmost importance for a parent to have a firm grasp on that science. After all, how can a parent guide a child toward living a good life if the parent does not even know what it means to live a good human life in the first place? How can parents succeed if they do not know the goal at which they are supposed to be aiming? This is one reason, among many others, why knowledge of the human good is something that is very important for our lives. The purpose of this video will be to begin our examination of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and specifically here I will focus on the first two chapters of Book 1. In addition, at various points I will also rely on the commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics given by the 13th century philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas. In this work, Aquinas goes line by line through the Nicomachean Ethics and gives his thoughts on Aristotle's arguments and ideas. And I will use this commentary to help provide further context and elaboration of Aristotle's text. In the first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle provides a general description of what he refers to as the good. Aristotle tells us that every skill and every inquiry, and similarly, every action and rational choice, is thought to aim at some good. And so, the good has aptly been described as that at which everything aims. There are three components of this very important statement that deserve further comment. In the first portion of the sentence, Aristotle tells us something about all the activities that humans engage in, every skill, inquiry, action, and choice. He identifies some characteristic or feature that all of these activities share. In the second portion of the sentence, Aristotle gives us a broad definition of the good. While not yet nearly specific enough, it does begin to show us something important about Aristotle's conception of the human good and what it means to live a good life. Finally, the way Aristotle represents these two portions of the sentence suggests that there is an argument here. The claim he makes about the structure of human activity in the first portion of the sentence seems as though it is meant to provide us with a reason to believe that the second portion of the sentence is true. And in what follows, we will consider all three of these aspects: Aristotle's conception of human activity, his description of the good, as well as the implicit argument that seems to be at work in this passage. We will begin with the first portion of the sentence, the claim that every skill, inquiry, action, and choice aims at some good. So what does this mean? Well, put simply, it just means that any activity we engage in has some purpose. There is some good that we are attempting to produce or achieve through that activity. For example, the purpose of developing the skill of cooking is to produce and enjoy a delicious meal. And the purpose of trying to find your keys is so that you can start your car and get to work. And the purpose of studying for an exam is to earn a good grade. His point then is simply that human activity is ordered towards specific goals, and furthermore, that those goals are good things that we are always in pursuit of. While it is natural to think in the way that Aristotle describes here, there are some important questions that we need to consider. First, one might ask whether all human activity really does aim toward an intentional and rationally chosen end. Aren't there some things that we do that seem random or chaotic or even thoughtless? Second, we might wonder whether every choice really is made for the sake of something that is good. Don't people sometimes choose what is evil? For instance, in the 2008 movie The Dark Knight, Alfred says the following to Bruce Wayne in order to get him to better understand the motivations of his nemesis, the Joker. Alfred tells Bruce Wayne, "Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn." Now, is that really possible? Do people sometimes choose what is evil for its own sake? St. Thomas Aquinas addresses these particular questions in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. First, let's consider the question, is all human activity really rationally and intentionally ordered towards some end for the sake of which that activity is undertaken? Certainly, there are some activities in the human body like respiration, circulation, and even muscle spasms that don't really seem to fit this description. These activities might be ordered towards some particular good, but that orientation is not conscious or intentional. It is a good thing, of course, that our heart pumps our blood and that we're able to breathe spontaneously without thinking about it. But again, these are not conscious activities. These are spontaneous, automatic bodily responses. So does this show that Aristotle's claim here is false? Well, not necessarily. Aquinas clarifies what sorts of activities that Aristotle must be talking about here. Aquinas explains that the human operations and activities that are relevant for this conversation are those springing from man's will, following the order of reason. Those actions like respiration and circulation, which do not fall under free will and rational choice, are not properly called human actions, but they are natural actions. It is certainly the case that many things go on within our bodies that we are not consciously aware of and have no control over. But those things are not what Aristotle means here. Instead, he is talking about voluntary human actions, like deciding whether to study or what to eat for lunch, or whether to tell a lie to your employer. A properly human action is something like this, which is subject to our voluntary control and to some extent the product of our rational deliberation. What about the second objection? When Aristotle says that all human activity is for the sake of some good, is he discounting the fact that some people perform bad actions for the sake of bad ends? Do some people really just want to see the world burn? There certainly do seem to be cases where someone does an action so irredeemable, so horrible, that the person must, it seems, want what is bad and evil. Aquinas gives the following response here in his commentary. He states, "There is no problem from the fact that some men desire evil, for they desire evil only under the aspect of the good, that is, insofar as they think it is good. Hence their intention primarily aims at the good and only incidentally touches on the evil." So what is going on when someone does something that they know is morally wrong? Suppose a person tells a lie. Does this imply either that they think lying is good or that they think their action has no benefit at all? Well, no, not necessarily. Aquinas explains here that while they desire to do something evil, it is because of some good aspect of that evil thing. For example, perhaps this person wants to lie in order to gain money or avoid punishment. Those are goods for that person. And while lying is still overall a morally wrong thing to do, this doesn't mean that this person is actually seeking what is bad through their choice to lie. They're simply seeking certain goods through morally wrong means. The case of a psychopath like the Joker, however, is more difficult to account for. After all, in the movie, the Joker robs a bank only to proceed to turn around and burn all of the money that he just gained through the robbery. So, what is the possible benefit here? However, even here, perhaps the Joker is still pursuing some good, namely the good of pleasure. Maybe it is the case that the Joker really is pursuing the perverse pleasure of watching the world burn. Previously, I mentioned that this initial sentence seems to be making an argument. Aristotle seems to be drawing a conclusion about what the good is like on the basis of his conception of human activity. Specifically, Aristotle argues here that the good is that at which everything aims. Let's call this the argument from the nature of human activity. Premise 1. Every human activity, every skill, inquiry, action, choice, etc., aims at some good. Then, from this premise, we infer the conclusion that there is some single good referred to as the good or the chief good at which every human activity aims. Aristotle does not use the term chief good in this initial sentence, but does use this terminology later on in chapter 2. Now, before we consider whether this is a good argument, let's first just try to understand what the conclusion of the argument is claiming. What does Aristotle mean when he says that the good is that at which everything aims? In essence, he is saying that not only does each individual human action have its own end or purpose, but furthermore, that there is some ultimate good or chief good which is the final goal for every single human action. To understand this point, let's consider some of Aristotle's examples from the next paragraph. He tells us that because there are many actions, skills, and sciences, that there are also many ends or many different goods. For instance, medicine pursues the good of health, Shipbuilding pursues the good of a completed ship, military science pursues the good of victory, and domestic economy seeks the good of wealth. Now, each of these is a worthwhile activity, but in a different way. And that is because each of these activities has a different immediate purpose or a different good which it pursues. However, it really isn't enough to simply say that each of these activities has its own particular good. If we really can say that each of these activities is good, then there must be something that they all share in common. There must be some final goal or end at which each of these distinct activities aims. Specifically, what makes each of these good is that in some form or fashion, to some degree, large or small, each contributes to the human good. So, Aristotle tells us that the good is that which all human actions aim toward. That is, the good human life is the aim or goal of every action we take and every endeavor we pursue. So while there are many actions and many ends pursued by those actions, ultimately all of our actions terminate in some single thing which we call the good, the chief good, or the good human life. But is that right? Do we really need to suppose that there is some chief good which is the end of all human action and activity? One might argue that we can imagine it is otherwise. Perhaps there is no highest ultimate good. Maybe there is no chief good of all action. Instead, isn't it at least possible that there is only separate actions and activities, each with their own end or goal? Why can't we just say that medicine pursues health, shipbuilding pursues ships, military science pursues victory, and domestic economy pursues wealth, but there is no ultimate good that is pursued by all of them? What justification does Aristotle have for supposing that there must be a chief good? In order to see this problem more clearly, let's return to examining the argument as a whole. Let's ask, does the premise of this argument give us a good reason to believe that its conclusion is true? Here, Aristotle argues that because every action is for the sake of some good, that there must be some single chief good at which all human actions ultimately aim. But is that a good inference? At first glance, it really does not seem to be. Consider the following parallel argument used by the commentator Christopher Warney to illustrate this point. Premise 1. Every road leads to some destination. Conclusion: there is some single destination where every single road leads. Now, obviously, this is not a good argument. It is true that every road leads to some destination, but that does not mean that all roads lead to the same place. Some roads do lead to Rome, but the vast majority do not, for instance. Couldn't that reasoning be applied to Aristotle's argument here as well? Sure, we might say, every human action has some end or some purpose. But that does not mean that every action ultimately has the same end or the same purpose. It does not mean that there is some single good at which all actions aim or that there is a chief good. It could just be the case that there are many activities and many goods pursued by those activities, but no single good that all activities are attempting to achieve. Does Aristotle's argument here fall prey to precisely the same obvious problem as the illustration argument we just mentioned? This is possible, but I think it would be more charitable to view Aristotle's argument not as fundamentally flawed, but merely as incomplete in its current presentation. I think Aristotle has some unstated premises in mind here, which supply the missing reasons for why we should think that all human actions lead towards some single good. Furthermore, I think he begins to outline these reasons in Chapter 2 of Book 1, and we will examine these points in the next section of this video. Aristotle begins chapter 2 with the following passage. So if what is done has some end that we want for its own sake, and everything else we want is for the sake of this end, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, because this would lead to an infinite progression, making our desires fruitless and vain, then this clearly will be the good, indeed the chief good. What I think we find here is the following argument for why there must be some chief good. Call this the argument from impossibility of pointless desire. Premise 1. If there is no chief good, then everything we desire is desired for the sake of something else. Premise 2. If everything is desired for the sake of something else, then all human desire is fruitless and vain. Premise 3. But it is not really the case that all human desire is fruitless and vain. Therefore, from these premises, it follows that there must be some chief good. Let's begin with premise 1. What Aristotle is saying is this: if there was no final or chief good, then everything we desire would be desired for the sake of some further thing. For example, if someone asks you, "Why are you watching this video?" you might say, "Well, I want to do well in this class." And if they ask you why you want to do well in the class, then you might say, "So that I can graduate." And if they ask why you want to graduate, then you might say, "So I can secure a good job." And of course, we can imagine these questions continuing on like this for a very long time. But the point that Aristotle is making in this premise is that if there is no final or chief good, then hypothetically this line of questioning could go on forever. That is, there would never be an endpoint where you could stop this line of questioning. There would always have to be some further thing you wanted, which would explain why you desire something or choose to pursue it. And if there is no final end of human life, then our desires would form an infinite chain with no endpoint, and there would not be anything ultimately that was desired for its own sake. Now, let's consider premise 2. This premise claims that if everything we want is always desired for some further purpose, then our desires would be fruitless and vain, to use Aristotle's phrase. Another way of putting this is that our desires will be pointless. So why would this be? Here again, I think it can be helpful to consult the commentary of St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argues that if we should proceed to infinity in our desire for ends, so that one should always be desired on account of another to infinity, we will never arrive at a point where a man may attain the ends desired. His basic point is that without a final end, we will never arrive at that which we are seeking through our action. Consider the following example. Suppose you decided to run a marathon. You train for a year, you sharpen up your diet, and you take care of any aches and pains you require in the course of your training. It is the day of the race and you're excited, and you show up at the starting line ready to see the fruits of your hard work. However, just before the race begins, the officials inform you that this race is no longer a marathon. You begin to get nervous. Is it an ultra marathon? Is it a triathlon? You haven't been on your bike or gone swimming in years. No, the official informs you that what is different about this race is that there is no finish line. Now, this news understandably throws you for a loop. It makes you question whether there is really any point to running the race in the first place. Presumably, you had some goal when you set out to run the marathon. Maybe you wanted to set a world record, maybe you wanted to win the race and collect the prize money, or maybe you just wanted to test your abilities or even just prove to yourself that you could simply complete the race. Now, any of these goals would be fine, but notice that all of them would be impossible without a finish line. If there is no finish line to the race, then you aren't really racing at all. You are not attempting to attain any goal, you are just running. And sometimes it is fine to just run, but that isn't a race. That isn't a goal-oriented activity. At this point, it would be entirely rational to decide that you will no longer run the race, and you would likely feel quite disappointed about this. If there is no end goal of the activity, then what is the point of beginning the activity in the first place? Now, let's apply this point more broadly. There are all sorts of things that you desire, like a good job, a close-knit family life, the leisure time to read good books and have stimulating conversations with friends, or perhaps you just want to watch every movie on Netflix. Again, each of these activities has its own particular end and its own particular good. But then we ask the question, what is the real purpose of all these activities? What is the ultimate purpose of everything I am doing? What is all of this leading to? Now, suppose the answer is nothing. There is no ultimate final good. Nothing you do has any ultimate purpose. Whenever you satisfy one desire, your motivation for doing so will always be some further good thing, and then another, without any endpoint. This would mean that life itself is like running a race without a finish line. But it seems that running a race without a finish line is pointless and nonsensical. So why would it make any more sense to live a human life that had no purpose, that had no ultimate goal? Furthermore, this would make our desires pointless, which is exactly what is claimed in premise 2 of the argument. Aquinas states that a man desires fruitlessly what he cannot get. If there never comes a point in time when our desires are finally fulfilled, where we have accomplished what we set out and wanted to achieve, if all life promises to us is one yet to be fulfilled desire after the next, then what would be the point of desiring anything in the first place? To put the point more bluntly, what would be the purpose of any human activity? What would be the purpose of human life at all? So, without a chief good, the very acts of desiring, choosing, and acting for the sake of attaining some good would lack any real purpose or justification. This brings us to the third premise of the argument. The claim here is that not all human desire is fruitless and vain. That is, the claim is that our actions are not pointless. We are not condemned to an unending chain of unsatisfied desire. And life is not ultimately an exercise in futility. Furthermore, if premise 3 is true, then this means that it is not the case that everything we want is for the sake of something else. That is, while the vast majority of things that we desire, we want because of something else they bring us, like money or a car or a house or a nice vacation or a college degree, there must be something that we want not for the sake of something else, not for some further reason, but something that we want for its own sake. Something that we desire purely because of its own intrinsic qualities and characteristics, and for no other reason outside of that. Furthermore, if there is something like this, then that must be the chief good. There must be some good that exists, that is desired by all humans, that serves as the ultimate end of all human action. So, a great deal hangs on Aristotle's assumption that our desires are not pointless and futile. But how does he know that this is the case? Sure, it may not be pleasant to think that everything we want and everything we do is ultimately pointless, but maybe life in the end is ultimately tragic. Maybe life does have no meaning. Maybe life has no real purpose. That could be a sad reality to face, but the fact that it is sad or uncomfortable does not necessarily mean that it is false. So why is Aristotle able to so confidently assert that our desire for the good is not useless? Fully answering this question would require more explanation of Aristotle's broader philosophy than is really possible here. However, I think we can again gain some insight by consulting Aquinas' commentary. Aquinas tells us that the desire for the good is natural. One way of explaining what this means is that the desire for the good represents one of the deepest and most thoroughly ingrained longings of human nature. Human beings are diverse and want many different things and find different kinds of lives appealing. But there is nobody who wants to live a bad life. There is nobody who thinks well of the prospect of being on their deathbed, looking back on how they lived their life and realize that they lived it poorly. No, nobody wants to be in that situation. Ultimately, all human beings want to live well. Furthermore, Aquinas claims that it is impossible for such a natural desire to be useless. In his view, and in Aristotle's, it simply cannot be the case that the deepest, most natural, most central human desire is ultimately impossible to attain. It cannot be the case that it is futile for us to want the good. For both thinkers, the claim that there must be a chief good rests on their conviction that human life is not completely tragic, and that our desire for the good is not a mere facade or illusion. With the preceding points in place, we now have a better sense of Aristotle's purpose in the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's purpose here is to determine the chief good and ultimate purpose of human life, to determine what it is that makes activities like medicine, shipbuilding, military science, domestic economy, or any other human activity worthwhile and good in an ultimate and final sense. Furthermore, Aristotle notes that knowledge of the chief good must be very important for our lives. It is this knowledge which gives us a target to aim at when thinking about how to live in a way that is conducive to our good and flourishing. Before proceeding, Aristotle identifies two questions we need to answer about the chief good. First, he states that we must try at least roughly to comprehend what the good is. Here he poses the basic and fundamental question, what exactly is the good or the chief good of human life? From the outset, it is important to have the right sort of expectations for what an answer to this question will look like. We should not expect Aristotle to ultimately tell us that the good human life is something very specific. For example, it would be rather strange if Aristotle said that the good human life was one devoted to climbing mountains or conducting scientific experiments, painting landscapes, or designing video games. All of these are great and fine things to do, but they are also not things that all human beings are really equipped to do or would find fulfilling. While Aristotle does believe that there are objective criteria for what constitutes a good life, human beings, it must be acknowledged, are also diverse, with different interests and abilities. So whatever the good is, it must be something that can accommodate the variety of different occupations and lifestyles that are found in human beings. Second, Aristotle claims that we need to understand which science or faculty is concerned with the human good. That is, what science studies the good as its subject matter. These two questions will be addressed in the next two sections of this video. We will begin with the first of these questions. What is the good? At present, we do not yet have a complete answer to this question. However, it still may be useful to see whether there is anything definitive that we can say about the good at this point. Now, based on Aristotle's comments in chapter 1, we do at least know that the good is that at which all human activity aims. It is the final end of all human action. But is there anything else that we can say about it? If we return to chapter 1, then we can see that there is in fact something else we can say about the good. Here Aristotle makes a point about the kind of value that is possessed by the good. He tells us that the end of the master science is more worthy of choice than the ends of the subordinate sciences. But what does this mean? What does it mean for some science to be subordinate or for some science to be more or less worthy of choice? To illustrate this point, let's use Aristotle's own example. He notes that the science of bridle making is subordinate to the science of horsemanship, that horsemanship is subordinate to military science, and that military science in turn is subordinate to victory. Now consider the first part of this chain, the claim that bridle making is subordinate to horsemanship. The art of bridle making is concerned with, as one would guess, making bridles that enable people to ride on horses more effectively and comfortably. Furthermore, horsemanship just is the art of riding a horse well. So here we can see why bridle making is subordinate to horsemanship. It is because the entire justification for bridle making, the very reason for its existence, comes from the needs of horsemanship. There is only a need for bridles because there is already a need for riding horses. To see this point, imagine the following. Imagine that you had to choose between bridle making and horsemanship. One of these activities would be gone forever, and the other would be preserved. The only sensible choice, it seems, would be to preserve horsemanship. After all, what good would it be to have a bunch of bridles if there is nobody who plans on riding a horse? So the clear choice would be to preserve horsemanship. Or as Aristotle puts it, horsemanship is more worthy of choice. It is an activity that is more important than bridle making, because bridle making is only undergone for the sake of horsemanship. The same can be said of the other cases. Horsemanship itself is undertaken for the sake of increasing the effectiveness of the military. So military science is more worthy of choice than horsemanship. Furthermore, victory is more worthy of choice than military science because the only reason we engage in military science is for the sake of being victorious in war. Of course, given what Aristotle has said prior to this chain of activities doesn't actually stop there at victory. This is because all human activity is ultimately oriented toward the good. This means that victory in war really isn't an end in itself. There is still some further end which explains why we pursue victory in war. Now, there may be some other subordinate ends along the way, but given what Aristotle has said, the ultimate reason for pursuing victory in war will be pursuit of the good. This means that the good is more important, more valuable, and more worthy of choice than victory in war. In fact, the good is more worthy of choice than any other end we can pursue. This means that it would never make sense to sacrifice the good, to sacrifice human flourishing for the sake of any other good, just as it would make no sense to sacrifice horsemanship for the sake of bridle making. It is very important to recognize what is implied by this. Consider the fact that victory in war is subordinate to the good. This means that there are limitations on how military victory should be pursued. Later, we will see that a substantial part of what it means to live a good life in Aristotle's view involves living a morally virtuous life. So what if there were a way to win a war through immoral means? For example, what if a nation could win a war through directly targeting innocent civilians? Now, to pursue victory in this way might be effective, but that would be to misunderstand what is more and less worthy of choice, what is more and less valuable. Victory in a just war is a good thing, but to pursue victory at the expense of the good is to act as though the good were subordinate to victory. But in fact, precisely the opposite is the case. The good will never be subordinate to any other end. So, there is now something else that we can say about the good. Not only is the good that at which all human activity aims, but in addition, the good is more worthy of choice than any other end. Furthermore, it would seem that 2 is implied by 1. If the good is that at which all human activities aim, then all other human activities must be subordinate to the good, and thus, the good must be more important and more worthy of choice in comparison to any other end. This means there is nothing for which it would make sense to sacrifice the good. The pursuit of pleasure, or power, or fame, or wealth, or popularity all may be good things in their place, but the pursuit of these things should not be undertaken if doing so requires sacrificing the good. While we still do not yet have a complete account of what the good is, we do have at least enough of a sense of what it is to say something about the second question. This is the question which asks, what science is it that studies the human good? On this point, Aristotle gives what might sound like a surprising response. He tells us that knowledge of the good would seem to be the concern of the most authoritative science, the highest master science. And this is obviously the science of politics. To our modern ears, this might sound like an odd answer because we tend to think of political science as the study of how elections work or the empirical study of voting patterns. However, when Aristotle talks about politics, he's not using the word in a narrow sense that might largely refer to elections or making deals in Congress. Rather, he is working with a classical and ancient sense of politics in which politics refers to the way in which we share a common life with one another. This will involve voting, elections, and legislation, but it will also refer to all the various ways in which human society is organized, from the family to the village to the city and the state. Furthermore, it is important to understand that Aristotle had a distinct vision of the relationship that politics and the political community has to our individual well being. In Aristotle's view, the political community does not just exist to enforce the law and impose taxes. It is a social community that exists for the sake of helping its members truly reach human flourishing. And in fact, Aristotle even thought that it would be impossible for a human being to live a good human life apart from that community. No human being can live well in isolation from others. We can see this from some famous passages from another work that was written by Aristotle, the Politics. And there he tells us that every community is established with a view to some good, and that the state or political community aims at good in a greater degree than any other and at the highest good. The purpose of the state is not just to prevent you from committing crimes and maintaining the roads, although it will do these things. But its broader purpose is to enable its members to pursue the good. Furthermore, Aristotle stresses not only that the political community can help us achieve the good, but that achieving the good is impossible without the political community. He famously states that man is by nature a political animal, and that anyone who has no need of society must be either a beast or a god. This is because there is a fundamental social instinct implanted in all men by nature. And this is not an instinct that we can satisfy through a solitary or isolated life. No human being is really self-sufficient. With these points in place, it would stand to reason that political science would be concerned with the human good. If politics is concerned with how human beings live with one another, and our shared life is essential for human well-being, then the science of politics could only determine how society should be organized and governed if it had an accurate conception of what it means to live a good human life. Keeping this in mind, let's look more closely at the reasons Aristotle gives for why the science of politics is the highest science. First, Aristotle notes that the science of politics is responsible for directing all the other sciences that contribute to human well-being. He tells us that even the most honorable of faculties, such as military science, domestic economy, and rhetoric, all come under political science. It is the job of politics to determine what sciences and activities will exist in the city, what role they will play, and how they will conduct their business. But of course, all sciences are supposed to be directed toward the good in an ultimate sense. From this, it would follow that the political science could not direct the other sciences well if it did not understand what was good for a human being. How, for instance, could political decisions about how the economy should be managed or how wealth should be distributed, how could these decisions be made without some conception of what role wealth and economic productivity plays in a good human life. Furthermore, because all other activities and sciences undertaken in the political community are directed by the science of politics, the science of politics is also more worthy of choice than all the others. Again, this implies, for example, that military success or economic efficiency should not be pursued to the detriment of the good. Finally, Aristotle's comments here show us that when he discusses the good, he does not see it as merely the good of an individual person. Rather, the good that Aristotle has in mind is what we might call the common good or the good of the whole community. Aristotle states that the good of the city is obviously a greater and more complete thing to obtain and preserve. For while the good of an individual is a desirable thing, what is good for a people or for cities is a nobler and even more godlike thing. This implies something important about the relationship between the individual and the city or the larger political communities in which we exist. A distinctively modern view of politics tends to see the purpose of the state as securing certain goods or rights for individual citizens. For example, as stated in the American Declaration of Independence, the government is supposed to secure the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Aristotle certainly does not completely deny this role of the state, but more fundamentally, the purpose of the state is to promote the common good. And while it will often be the case that the good is the same for an individual as for a city, if these two things conflict, then it is the good of the city, which is something more noble and more godlike, that should take precedence. As such, Aristotle's comments here show a fundamental reorientation of how we tend to think about politics in modern times. It is the good of the community which is more worthy of choice than the good of any individual citizen. As such, it would be inappropriate to sacrifice the common good for the sake of promoting the good of some individual within the community. We have seen that Aristotle's purpose is to answer perhaps the most fundamental question of human life. What does it mean to live a good human life? What is the purpose of all human activity and action? To put the question in a way that might be more familiar to us now, we might say that Aristotle's asking the question of what is the meaning of life? We know that the answer is pursuit of the good, but this answer is not yet very helpful since beyond some very general principles, we do not yet know what the good is. Aristotle has not yet defined for us what it means to live a good human life, but we will turn to this point more directly in the lectures that follow.